Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Dr. Susan Love Research Foundation Research Results Webinar, a conversation with Dr. David Spiegel from Stanford University School of Medicine. My name is Leah Wilcox. I'm the Army of Women Research Project Manager. And we also have here with us today Naz Sykes, the Dr. Susan Love Research Foundation Executive Director. And Naz and I are very pleased to welcome Dr. David Spiegel and the Project Director Bita Nouriani today to talk to us about the stress and breast cancer study that the Army of Women, a lot of you participated in. For a quick introduction of Dr. Spiegel, he is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral science, a member of the Stanford Cancer Institute, and medical director of the Stanford Center for Integrative Medicine. Dr. Spiegel's research interests involve stress and health, cognitive control over somatic functions, including cancer progression, the response to traumatic stress, and the perception of pain and anxiety. He is currently conducting a large-scale study of the relationships among sleep disturbance, diurnal stress hormone patterns, and breast cancer survival, sponsored by the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Spiegel is also continuing study of the relationship between the acute response to trauma, including dissociative symptoms, and the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. He is also evaluating various methods of treating these symptoms. Dr. Spiegel is carrying out studies of the neurophysiological components of hypnosis by studying brain correlates of hypnotic perceptual alteration using PET, fMRI, and diffusion tensor imaging. His research program is designed to examine neurophysiological and peripheral mechanisms through which psychological and social support may influence physical health. But today, we are very excited to provide an opportunity to all of you to virtually meet Dr. Spiegel and Bita and hear about the stress and breast cancer study. The research team, the focus of the study was to learn about the relationship between psychological factors such as stress, quality of sleep, hormones, immunity, and cancer progression. So today, Dr. Spiegel and Bita are going to present on the study, and then at the end, everyone will have a chance to ask questions. So along the way, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in, and then we'll do a question and answer session at the end. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Spiegel, and please go ahead and get started.
You're most welcome. Bita and I are here saying hi, Bita.
Hello. Hello, everybody.
And we first of all want to thank Army of Women for just being wonderful partners in this research and giving us tremendous assistance in the recruitment for this study. And we look forward to many other studies with you. And we're very grateful to the women who participated in the study, who considered participating. And we hope that among those of you who are listening, you'll consider participating in other studies of ours as well. But I can tell you that as a clinical researcher, one of the hardest parts of any kind of research is contacting and involving the subjects in the studies, and Army of Women has made a tremendous leap forward in helping us to contact people who may be interested. On a personal note, I also just want to send along my best wishes to Dr. Susan Love. We were all shocked that she was ill, and we're delighted to hear that her transplant seems to be working and she's doing well and is expected back at work, and we send her all of our best wishes. What I'd like to do is discuss with you now a bit of the background of how we got into this line of research and then talk about what we found so far. We have a lot more investigation to do, but this was a study sponsored by the National Cancer Institute on stress and sleep, circadian hormones, and breast cancer. What I will discuss with you, and we'll leave plenty of time for discussion and questions, is the notion of circadian rhythms and cancer. Circadian rhythms are simply daily patterns like sleep and wakefulness and changes in hormone levels that occur throughout the day and night. And this study is a reminder that we should all do what our grandmothers told us to, which is eat well, sleep well, and get plenty of exercise. That's an important part of coping with cancer. In a sense, when you've got cancer, you need to be in training like an athlete. You need to take better care of your body, not just focus on the treatments themselves, but on how you're helping your body cope as well as it can with cancer, because the real story with cancer is not just the growth of the tumor, but how the body reacts to it. And that is subject to all kinds of control systems from the brain. and that's the kind of thing we're studying. In particular, we're looking at circadian cortisol dysregulation. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and I'll explain about that changes very much throughout the day and night, and those patterns seem to be important as well. I'll talk about our sleep study, depression and sleep, and how we're learning about differences in sleep phase of cortisol in relation to sleep and how this may affect disease progression. And then I'll have some final comments. We've known for a long time, that sleep is important in cancer. And there was a little article in Time magazine, back when there was a Time magazine, about sleep and cancer. And what has been found, and this is really of great interest, is that sleep disruption is a risk factor for cancer. It's been known for a long time now, for example, that women who do nighttime shift work are at higher risk for getting breast cancer. And the World Health Organization has designated shift work as a probable carcinogen, just below the level of absolute certainty. Among 5 ranks, it's the second rank of evidence. So it's getting pretty clear that disruption in sleep is an important risk factor for cancer, and there are many thoughts about it. Melatonin is a hormone that is elevated at night, down during the day, and that may be one of the hormones that's important. But this diagram shows you that there are a variety of factors, stress, social support, and the rhythms of hormones and sleep that affect the body's well-being through hormone activity, through immune defenses as well. And some of these, changes in some of these, can actually affect the rate of tumor growth. So one way to cope well with cancer is to take care that your body's circadian rhythms, sleep and wakefulness as being the major one, are handled well. This next diagram shows you the patterns of a particular hormone, cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that's secreted by the adrenal cortex, and it mobilizes glucose into the blood. So it prepares you to fight or flee when you're stressed. It goes up during an acute stress, but it also has a dramatic daily pattern. So if you look at the middle green line in this chart here, you see the pattern of cortisol starts to rise late in the night, and it's about as high as it's going to be shortly after you wake up in the morning. So right now, those of us particularly on the West Coast have pretty high cortisol levels. It goes down during the day, and by the evening it should be something like a third as high as it is in the morning. That's a nice normal diurnal pattern of cortisol, and that's normal. The high green line shows you cortisol patterns among women who are depressed. And you see that it's lost this daily variation. This pattern is high and flat. The red line at the bottom is people with post-traumatic stress disorder, and here it's low and flat. So in both cases of these rather prevalent psychiatric disorders, you see a dysregulation of the pattern of cortisol, and that turns out to be important if you have cancer. So your body, when stressors occur, increases its production of cortisol, but then there's a very powerful feedback system that tends to shut it off once it's done. The body doesn't want to waste metabolic resources when the stress is over, so it tends to shut itself off. But what can happen if you're chronically stressed, and this is something cancer patients know a lot about, because cancer isn't just one big stressor, it's a series of stressors that involve your concerns about disease progression, fears about dying, treatment decisions, side effects of treatment, effects of surgical treatment, changes in your social roles, and in this country, financial problems in relationship to health care as well. So there are a whole series of stressors. And what can happen is when the system keeps getting turned on, it gets stuck in the on position. It's like a broken light switch that's been overused. And so the system stays on all the time, as you see on the lower left here, or sometimes it's off all the time, as you saw with post-traumatic stress disorder. But the system gets dysregulated, and you're not responding physiologically to stress the way you should. We examined this among women with metastatic breast cancer, and we found that the majority of our patients had abnormal cortisol patterns. So the blue line is a nice normal one, high in the morning, going down in the evening. But many of them had increases during the day, or patterns where it peaked later in the day or just stayed flat. And Sandra Sefton, who was then a postdoc in my lab, made the observation that women with these abnormal patterns of cortisol actually had shorter subsequent survival. So we're following out now here over 10 years. The cortisol patterns during the day were measured here at the beginning. And you see that over time these curves diverge, and the ones with the normal patterns tended to live longer than the ones with the abnormal patterns. And this is independent of all the other risk factors we know about for breast cancer, like estrogen or progesterone receptor status, time from initial diagnosis to relapse, age at diagnosis. This is independent of that. So it's an independent predictor of subsequent survival time, suggesting that dysregulated stress hormones may have an effect on the rate of disease progression. And just this year, Dr. Sefton and I have published a similar study among men and women with lung cancer. And it basically shows the same thing, that the ones who have the normal steep slope where it declines during the day have better survival than those who have a flattened slope. So it suggests that these hormones are important in the way the body can cope with the progression of cancer. Now, there are other psychological factors that can affect disease progression, and one that we published recently in the Journal of Clinical Oncology is depression. So Janine Giese-Davis and other colleagues and I looked at the pattern of depression, and that's where you're not just feeling sad, but you're feeling hopeless, helpless, and worthless. You may have thoughts of suicide. Your energy is terrible. And it's a major psychiatric illness that affects about 8% of the population in any given year, but the rates are higher among women with particularly advancing cancer. And we found that the ones whose depression was getting worse had shorter subsequent survival than those whose depression was getting better. So this is another factor like the cortisol that can predict disease outcome, and again, independent of the usual risk factors associated with cancer. Recently, we found that women who had more normal cortisol patterns had a better response to treatment for depression than those who had the abnormal patterns. So the patterns and the depression can interact. And the ones whose stress response system is more normal actually respond better to psychotherapy. And we're trying to understand what we can do to help everybody respond better to psychotherapy. But in particular, this shows that the more normal patterns are an indication that even if you're depressed, you're better able to respond to psychotherapy for the depression. Now, getting to the study that the Army of Women helped us with here, we looked at the relationship between these abnormal cortisol patterns and sleep disturbance. And this was just a self-report measure. But those who had the more normal patterns reported fewer awakenings during the night than those who had these flat slopes, who reported they were getting up all the time at night and were not sleeping well at all. And this led us to apply to the National Cancer Institute for a more detailed study of stress, sleep, and disease progression. So, Bita, would you like to explain how we actually recruited women to the study?
Yes, so initially we had a phone screening, and of course we had women from all over the country. The phone screening was about 20 minutes to see if our potential participant had advanced cancer. And the study was explained, and once they agreed to participate, the second phase was to do consenting and more detailed screening of treatment and diagnosis, as well as making sure, because there's a phase in the study that involved coming to the hospital and staying for 28 hours to draw blood and taking saliva samples and collecting sleep. So we wanted to be sure that that was psychologically appropriate. It was not going to be too stressful, so there was a psychological screening. And once both the women and us made the decision that that was the right study for them, they enrolled, and they participated for a 2-week data collection at home, which involved taking, answering questions about their sleep in the morning within half an hour of waking up. We had a device called the Actigraph that they were wearing every day for the 2 weeks, and this Actigraph helped us calculate the hours of sleep and also their activity during the day. And 2 nights out of those 2 weeks, we had, for the women that were local, we had our sleep technician go to their home and do a ambulatory recording of their sleep, which that really actually helped us look at the sleep more closely. With the ambulatory recording, we could look at various stages of sleep for those 2 nights. And for our women that came from other parts of the country, they came and stayed in a hotel for 2 nights. But they did the 2-week collection at their home. And then at the end, the study involved coming to our lab, either at the hospital or at our sleep clinic, and did a 28-hour stay. And for the 24 hours of it, we had blood draws. During the day, it was an hour every hour, and at night it was every 20 minutes, and we were looking at various hormones during that time.
Okay, thank you, Vita. And I should explain, the ActiWatch is just, it looks like a wristwatch. You wear it on your wrist, and it's a monitor of your movement throughout the day and night, and also the amount of light you receive. The at-home and laboratory sleep monitoring involve electrodes on your scalp, recording like an electroencephalogram, and it's a more detailed physiological recording of brain activity during sleep. And we got a problem here because, there we go, okay. So this now summarizes the number of people that were involved in the study, and again, we're very appreciative. And as you can see, that of the 545 initially contacted, including flyers and our own hospital here at Stanford, we got 356 contacts from Army of Women, 2/3 of the contacts that we had for the study. We did some assessments and excluded people for various reasons as not being suitable for the study. We wound up with 106 women who qualified for the study. Some simply were not interested when they heard about what we had to do. Some we had to exclude for medical or other reasons. And we wound up with 105 women completing the study. And so it was a tremendous help to us to have the assistance of Army of Women in doing this. We had healthy controls as well, and some of you listening may be healthy controls. We contacted 119 initially, and we wound up with 27 healthy controls. 24 ultimately analyzed, 27 enrolled in the study. There we go. So here are the subjects in the study. The majority of them were in the middle years of 40 to 49. The ethnicity, the age at initial diagnosis, oh, I see, that was age at initial diagnosis. Thank you, Vita. Diagnosed in the 40s by and large. Ethnicity was 3/4 white, but a number Black, Asian, and Hispanic people as well. There was a range in marital status, about 57% were married, 25.7% were divorced. Moderate income, that's the income distribution of the sample. We have staging and initial diagnosis here, and the most frequent were stage 2, but there was a range of that as well. 80% were estrogen receptor positive in their tumors. 23.8% HER2 human epidermal growth factor receptor positive. There was an array of treatments that they had undergone. Karnowski performance status is a rating of just how physically active you are, and they were in pretty good shape on that measure with scores in the 90s, and about half of them were unemployed. Were not employed, which is a little worse than the national unemployment rate at the moment. Glad to say it's going down. This was a challenging protocol. We're very grateful. Some traveled to us from all over the United States. They all took time off from work and time away from their families. And I have to say that I was worried because this was not a treatment study, but it's a tribute to Beta and her staff that our subjects felt so well cared for by the research staff and the nurses in the hospital that they actually viewed it as a kind of mini vacation, I think. They felt very well cared for in the clinical research center and during the at-home and the hotel recordings that we did. We also, the way we actually recorded blood samples throughout the night, you may wonder how could you do that. We certainly didn't stick people each time. We had an indwelling catheter that was very long. It was about 12 feet long, and it went through a hole in the wall to the next room so that we could draw blood without waking people during the night as well. And we had some problems sometimes maintaining the patency of these IV lines. So our subjects put up with a lot, and I'm very grateful. And there were many when the IV closed who said, well, I don't like it, but go ahead and stick me again, and we want to complete the study, and they were very helpful. So I want to now talk about some of the preliminary results. We have a lot more to do. In this study, we were looking at the relationship between depression and our sleep measures, and we recorded, as I mentioned, polysomnography. This is the EEG recordings on the scalp. We used a standard measure of depression, and we looked at family structure as well in this study. Ariana Aldrich-Jerry, who's a postdoctoral fellow psychologist in our laboratory, took the lead in this analysis, along with Jamie Zeitzer, who did a lot of the laboratory and sleep analyses. Oksana Polish, who is a psychologist specializing in sleep and sleep treatment for cancer patients. Wheel Joe, our biostatistician. Vita, as we mentioned, Eric Neri, our data manager. We looked, among other things, at sleep architecture and depression, as well as family status among women with metastatic breast cancer. So these are some of the first results from the study. We presented this at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting in Chicago this past spring, and Dr. Aldrich-Jerry actually got an award for the presentation. And what you see is that the group that was at most risk for sleep disruption had two characteristics. They were more depressed, and they were single. They did not have a spouse or partner. And those are the yellow bars here. And what you see is that they had significantly less total sleep time than the other. So these were women who either were married or who were not depressed, or who were both married and not depressed. They had more waking after sleep onset than the other groups. So this means once you fell asleep, they tended to wake up more during the night. They had less stage 2 sleep. There are 4 stages of sleep, and stage 2 is a deeper stage of sleep. It's not dreaming sleep, but it's a deeper stage of sleep. And the yellow bar here had less of it than the other groups. And they had more stage 1 sleep, so they tended to spend more time in the latest stage of sleep, which accounts for the fact that they were waking more. So what it suggests is that the combination, in particular, being depressed and not having a partner, led to sleep disruption. And there's a concept that Ellen Frank has pioneered at the University of Pittsburgh, what are called social zeitgebers, the idea that having a spouse or partner kind of is a time setter for you. And you may have noticed that when your partner's away, you tend to just not get to bed at quite the same time, and you stay up and watch television or do something. And so having social contact tends to standardize your sleep behavior, and all of us are sleep deprived. None of us probably get as much sleep as we should because we have too much light-driven activity, like television and computers, at night that tend to make us postpone going to sleep. Here you're seeing the way in which we analyze the cortisol. I mentioned these long IVs. So we could analyze the patterns of cortisol in metastatic breast cancer patients and controls throughout the day and the night. And here you see that rise in cortisol that happens early in the morning as you get ready to wake up. And interestingly, we were a little surprised at this. There weren't any big differences in the cortisol patterns throughout the 28-hour cycle between our metastatic breast cancer patients and our control subjects. The little black dots are the breast cancer patients, the white circles are the controls, and they look pretty similar, which is a bit of a surprise. Here's how we analyze the pattern of cortisol. The measures are these little black dots here, and what we do is we fit a line that represents the pattern of cortisol increase and decrease. It's like plotting an average line, only it's a curve because it goes up and down. And one of the things that we observed, and this is a novel finding in our study that we're pursuing now, is what we call a phase delay in the cortisol peak. You may remember that I mentioned that cortisol tends to get higher throughout the early morning hours and peaks just after you wake up. Well, the interesting thing is for the controls, it's about an hour after you tend to wake up. For our breast cancer patients, it was almost 2 hours. So, well, there's about a 30-minute difference, and this was statistically significant. So it suggested that our breast cancer patients were waking a bit earlier in relation to their physiological cycle involving cortisol. So in a sense, they may have been getting up a little bit too early before their bodies were really ready to get up. And this may relate to some other aspects of their sleep disturbance, and that's something that we're examining right now in our data. There are some people also who tend to like to get up earlier or later, and it's a kind of a trait that people have. We call them owls and larks. The owls like to be up late at night. The larks like to get up early in the morning. And there's a questionnaire called the Owl and Lark Questionnaire, and some of you in the audience may know whether you're an owl or a lark, whether you function better late at night or you like to be up first thing in the morning. And there was a distribution of scores among our patients. And when we looked at the relationship here, and this was the lead in this study was a Dr. Bongjin Ham, who came here for a year from Korea, from South Korea, and contributed a great deal to our research. And we found that 10 of our subjects said they were definitely morning types. 33 said they were moderately morning types. 36 said neither, and 6 were moderately evening types. And we looked at the relationship between their preference for when they like to get up and go to sleep to the disease-free interval, the time from initial diagnosis to the first diagnosis of metastasis. And the shorter the disease-free interval, the shorter the ultimate survival time, because it means the cancer is progressing more rapidly. And you see that there was a notable difference. Those who had neither type tended to have a shorter, and particularly those who were evening types, tend to have a shorter disease-free interval than those who were morning types. So it looked as though being a morning type seemed to be somewhat protective, although this was not statistically significant. But here you see what are called the survival curves, where people tended to survive longer if they tended to be morning types. But again, we're just in the middle of these analyses. It was not statistically significant. So we also looked at the relationship between when people wanted to go to bed and when they actually went to bed. So how well aligned were their desires to go to sleep from what they actually did. This was statistically significant. And what you see here is that those who went to bed when they preferred to, who let themselves go to sleep when they wanted to, had significantly longer disease-free intervals than those who were misaligned, either going to bed earlier than they wanted to or later than they wanted to. So, and this is a pretty hefty difference. So it suggests that honoring your body's desire to go to sleep is a good idea, because the people who did tended to live longer than those who didn't. And here you see the difference in survival, and this is a pretty robust difference. So if you tend to like to go to sleep early, treat yourself to it and go to sleep early. If you like to go to sleep later, okay, do that, but make sure you get enough sleep. So the misalignment tended to be the more powerful than the chronotype, than whether you're an owl or a lark. It's whether you honored your desire and went to sleep earlier or later if that's what you wanted to do. And that relationship to disease-free interval was highly significant. Now, why would this have an effect on disease progression? We're in the middle of a whole bunch of studies of that I can't go into in detail now. But one study that I'll mention, led by Oksana Polish in our group, took a look at what we call vagal tone. Now, we have, a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic one increases heart rate and blood pressure and makes you sweat. Parasympathetic calms you down. It's a calming influence. And a measure of that is what we call vagal tone. It's the ability for the parasympathetic system to shut off that arousal response. And we all know that if you had a really bad night's sleep, you're irritable during the day. Even minor problems just set you off. That's a loss of vagal tone. You can't self-calm very well. And she found in a group of metastatic breast cancer patients that those who sleep better at night have better vagal tone during the day. So a good night's sleep also prepares you to calm yourself and handle the stresses that will inevitably come during the day. And that's an area that we're actively pursuing as well. So we're thinking that there are relationships between stress and how you handle it, including hormone dysregulation and sleep disruption, as well as social support, that can affect the functioning of endocrine and immune system in relationship to not just quality of life, but potentially to the rate of cancer progression as well. So what we know so far is that dysregulation of circadian cortisol is related to cancer progression, seems to be related to waking more in advance of the morning cortisol peak. Sleep misalignment is not a good thing, and it's related to shorter time from initial diagnosis to disease progression. These circadian phase relationships seem to matter in terms of indices we have now of disease progression. So losing sleep over cancer might be something to lose sleep over, except we want you to gain sleep from the results of this study. It was funded by a grant from the National Cancer Institute on sleep and breast cancer. Paige McDonald is our program officer, and we're very appreciative of the NCI for helping us to do it. And I think one very important issue in the decisions we're making about our federal government is sustained support for research from the National Institutes of Health, which is a leader. We're a model for the world in providing support that improves people's health, as well as stimulating the economy by discovering new things that help the economy grow. And it's very important that we maintain our support for the National Cancer Institute and other institutes of the National Institute of Health to help us help our patients do better and also help our country do better. This is just a plug for the Army of Women. If you're not a member, please join. Here's some information about how to do it. But I want to thank the Army of Women for their tremendous support of our research, and it's been a pleasure working with the women. I want to thank the women who did participate, who were tremendous help to us in learning what we're learning. We have a lot more to learn. We're going to be analyzing over the next year in detail the data we got about circadian hormones, sleep patterns, and their depression and their relationship to other factors that help women with breast cancer live better and hopefully live longer as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spiegel, so much. That was wonderful. And we do have some questions for you from the attendees, and I just want to let everyone know who's listening to go ahead and type in your questions if you have any, and we're happy to get to those. So first, we're going to start with a question from Mary. Mary wants to know if stress was a causal factor in breast cancer once and was removed successfully, does that make the woman a high risk for breast cancer in the future if the stress is removed?
Well, Mary, that's a complicated question. The literature on stress and breast cancer risk does suggest, in some but not all studies, that stress is a factor in relationship to breast cancer. I suppose first of all, there are lots of reasons why we get cancers, and the major ones are biological, that our genomes are vulnerable to changes that can lead certain cells to lose their control and proliferate more than they should, losing their natural characteristics. So it's a failure of cell differentiation. And it's very important to not be more certain than we can be about the links between stress and cancer. They're there, but it's not the whole story. So we're biological creatures and vulnerable. Stress can contribute to it, and there are some studies that show that it does. I'd say one interesting study we did a couple of years ago was we looked at Marin County was known to be a sort of breast cancer hotspot, and so there was an epidemiological study of the histories of women with breast cancer in Marin County matched to women who were comparable in other ways but didn't live in Marin County and didn't have breast cancer. And what we found was that stress in and of itself did not distinguish the ones with breast cancer from the ones who didn't have it. But the women who came from families where there was serious trauma in childhood, physical and sexual abuse, but who said, gee, my family was wonderful, it was terrific, those women were at higher risk for getting breast cancer. So I think there's a message there, and the message is, life has stressors in it. There's no life without stress. But how you handle the stress may be an important factor. And I'd say the message from that study is call a spade a spade. If you are stressed, deal with it. Don't pretend everything's fine when it isn't. And I think that's the message. So if there is a stress breast cancer, and it's happened once, it's certainly possible that one is at higher risk. But I'd say take the message, and if stressors happen, deal with them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Liz has a question, and she wants to know, as a survivor, what can she do to lower her risk of recurrence in terms of sleep? And she also wants to know if you looked at naps during the day.
Sure, Liz. It's a good question and an important one. And as I said, I think what you want to do is kind of, consider yourself in training. That part of what helps fight your breast cancer is the hormonal treatments, which are very effective, the chemotherapy, radiotherapy, whatever, the surgical treatments. They're very important. Do them, but that's the beginning, it's not the end. So think of your body as having to deal with this potential invasion of tumors, and you've got to keep your body in shape to deal with it. And your body has hormonal and immune and other factors that control providing blood vessel support for tumors. And you have to help your body get all the sleep it needs. And that means three things. It means giving yourself plenty of time to go to sleep at night. And, cancer is a kind of wake-up call for many people. It's a way of saying, many of my breast cancer patients are sort of human shock absorbers. They just take on everybody else's problems and deal with them. And cancer is a way of saying, you know what, you've got your limits. And so don't take on more than you can. And that includes getting plenty of sleep, and that means 7 to 8 hours at night minimum, is part of your cancer treatment. And if something else comes up that needs doing, you can do it tomorrow or get someone else to do it. So make sure you get plenty of sleep. Make sure that you're in a room where you don't get interrupted, where there's no light at night. It's actually important not to have light exposure when you're trying to sleep, because that suppresses melatonin in the brain, and that can be an important factor in sleep as well. Get activity during the day. People who are more physically active during the day tend to sleep better at night. And so physical activity during the day is good for your cardiovascular health. It's good for other kinds of health. And by the way, one thing we often don't realize is that more breast cancer patients die of heart disease than breast cancer. And so the treatments have gotten much better. People are living much longer and better with breast cancer, which is great, but it means you've then got the other diseases that kill people, particularly heart disease, that can occur. And physical activity is good for your heart and good for your health and good for your sleep. The third factor is weight control and diet. And obesity interferes with sleep. It interferes with physical activity. It is associated with more rapid progression of breast cancer. So getting yourself in training in those three areas, sleeping well at night, physical activity, and diet and weight control, are very important ways of affecting the course of breast cancer as well as your general health.
Excellent, excellent tips. Thank you. So we have Valerie and Peggy both have questions along the same lines. They're curious if you suggest people use sleeping aids, and then how would the use of a sleeping aid, affect the cortisol levels?
Well, that's a good question, Valerie and Peggy. In general, I'm not a big fan, particularly of chronic use of medication for sleep. What tends to happen, they can, particularly the benzodiazepines, the ones that are like Xanax or alprazolam or other anti-anxiety drugs, do affect cortisol levels, and you'd rather not interfere with your cortisol regulatory control. In the short term, there are some antidepressant medications like trazodone, Desiril, that can be less habit-forming and help you to sleep. But in general, pharmacologic sleep aids are good, can be helpful in the short term, but are not a good idea for long-term sleep problems. So if you have them, it's a good idea if you're really having trouble sleeping, to get a sleep evaluation. And Beta has a comment as well to make about other things that can impair sleep.
Yeah, so for example, if you're suspicious of having sleep apnea, that means that there's an obstruction in the airway. If you hear from your bed partner or others that you snore heavily or you stop breathing during the night, it's really important to get a sleep evaluation because that can really affect your sleep, and especially this gets worse when we reach the menopause years. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, so sleep apnea is a not uncommon illness in which the part of your soft palate, which is what covers up your respiratory system when you swallow so you don't inhale instead of digest food, tends to collapse and cover your airway when you're deeply asleep. So what happens is you wind up waking up hundreds of times a night. So if you sometimes have the experience of not being able to breathe when you're asleep, if, as Vita mentioned, your bed partner noticed that you snore very loudly, if you wake up with a headache and feeling like you haven't slept well at all, it's good to get a formal sleep evaluation because there are some physical interventions that can be used to treat sleep apnea.
Excellent. And we have a question about the cortisol levels, and Vicki wants to know, is there anything women can do to help regulate their cortisol levels during the day?
Vicki, that's a good question. I would say good, vigorous physical activity is a good idea. That's one thing, and good stress management is another. So physically, stressors, part of the problem that we have is that we were built physiologically to deal mostly with physical stressors. So, in the early days of evolution, if a saber-toothed tiger came after you, you wanted to run very quickly and get out of the way. And now most of our stressors are psychological, not physical, but our bodies keep reacting as if they were physical. Heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol go up. So sometimes having regular physical activity can help you think through and deal with the psychological stressors that are a part of your life, and it's also good for your body. So part of it is just good physical activity can help manage your cortisol levels. But the other is good stress management, and I would say that handling acute stress well is a good way of reducing chronic stress. So the acronym I use is FACES. You want to face rather than flee from something that is causing you stress. You want to alter your perception of it. Find a way of focusing not just on what's happening to you, but the C is to cope actively. Find some way that you can do something about whatever the stressor is. You may not be able to make it go away, but the minute you have an action plan, you feel less helpless about it. The E is to express emotion. That is, we tend to feel that we should hide how we're feeling about having cancer or other stresses in life. And we find that expressing rather than suppressing emotion is a good way of honoring our body's natural way of responding to stressors and building rather than reducing social support, not isolating ourselves. And the S is for social support. Don't do it alone. Get help and support from friends, family, other cancer patients. Support groups are very helpful as well. So facing and dealing with these stressors, I think, is also a way of normalizing our cortisol response, and that's something that we're looking at now. There are other techniques like mindfulness-based stress reduction or learning self-hypnosis that can also help people manage their stress response and potentially normalize it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those great tips. So Dana had a question about the women you enrolled. You also enrolled and studied women with recurrent breast cancer, and she just wanted to clarify if they were included in the results you reported on today.
Yes, they were primarily metastatic rather than recurrent, but we did have a few recurrent subjects, and they were also included in the analysis.
Perfect, perfect. And so the let's see, Sherry has a question about melatonin. What do you think about taking more melatonin?
Sherry, melatonin is interesting. It's secreted by the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is right near where the nerves from the retina cross and then go to the back part of the brain. It's very light sensitive, so it's high at night, and it seems to set our body's circadian clock. So it tells us this is nighttime, time to sleep, shut down physical activity. It's also got antioxidant properties. It's a free radical scavenger, and so some people think that it's part of the mechanism of why it is that nighttime shift work may increase cancer risk. Melatonin taken as a medication has not been shown to help much with sleep disruption. There's no evidence that I know of that it actually has an effect on either cancer risk or cancer progression. The one use, and I use it myself for this, is for jet lag. So if you're traveling, taking melatonin can help reset your body's biological clock in the new time zone. And it's useful for that, but I don't think there's evidence at this point that it's useful as any kind of an anti-cancer treatment.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have two people, Dee Dee and Susan, are wondering if you recommend napping during the day.
Oh yeah, that napping came up before. I was asleep at the switch on that. Napping, napping is fine as long as you don't get into a pattern where you nap during the day but have trouble sleeping at night, or you're chronically sleep deprived at night so you need to nap during the day. I think if you're getting a decent amount of sleep at night and you're feeling a little tired during the day, an afternoon nap is fine. If you wake up feeling refreshed, by all means, go ahead and do it. But you just don't want to get to where you're beginning to reverse your rest activity pattern so that you're doing a lot of sleeping during the day and not much sleeping at night. That's when you're heading for trouble. But if you're sleeping pretty well at night and you're just feeling a little tired and want to take a nap during the day, by all means, do it.
Well, we'll be sure to talk about that in the office today. Oh, no, we're not. No, we never take a nap here. So
during the webinar, please. That's
exactly during the webinar. Sabine had a question that kind of follows up on that, and she is curious how many hours of sleep are desirable.
Well, Dean, people do vary. But I would say a good target number is 7 to 8 hours of sleep. Less than 7 is, for most people, not enough. There are some people who can do okay on 5. I read an article recently in Vanity Fair that said President Obama is only getting 5 hours of sleep a night, and I don't think it's enough from watching him on television recently. I actually had the privilege of hearing him last night in San Francisco, and he was wide awake and was great, but I worry about it. I think in general, while some people can do okay on 5 or 6, there are some genuine short sleepers. For most of us, you really need 7 to 8 hours of really good sleep. And in general, I think we don't allow ourselves to get enough. So target 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep.
Excellent. All right. And then Sarah is curious if there was any control for women who are on antidepressants and the incidence of breast cancer. And also, should antidepressants be part of the treatment along with the steroids like tamoxifen, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And talk with your doctor about this. Antidepressants are good medications. They can help, but some antidepressants, like fluoxetine, Prozac, and paroxetine, Paxil, compete with a metabolizing system called the cytochrome P450 system that metabolizes medications with tamoxifen. So those of you who are on tamoxifen, the active form of tamoxifen is prepared by your body. It's called endoxifen. And if you're on one of these antidepressants and tamoxifen, you may have reduced metabolism of the tamoxifen to the active form, the endoxifen. So it can reduce the effectiveness of the tamoxifen. That's not a good thing. There are other antidepressants, citalopram and others, that don't do this. So if you're on tamoxifen and an antidepressant, check with your doctor about whether it's the right one to use. If it is the right one, it can be a very effective help in treating depression. But if it's not the right one, it could be a problem and could interfere with your treatment. So it's important to discuss that with your doctor.
Great, thank you. Jolene wants to know if diet impacts cortisol levels, and if so, what dietary changes can be made to help regulate cortisol levels?
Well, that's a good question. Diet and also obesity, they can produce what's called insulin resistance, where you tend to have chronically high glucose, and cortisol can add to the chronically high glucose. I would say in general, our diets tend to be carbohydrate rich and protein and fiber poor, and that's not good for your insulin cortisol balance. So insulin suppresses glucose, cortisol increases it, and the balance between insulin and cortisol is important for your overall diet. In general, in America, we have a terrible diet that is terribly over-processed, devoid of flavor, full of fats and carbohydrates that we don't need. And that's bad for us. And in general, getting back to a diet, I tell my patients, don't eat anything that comes in a package or a box. You know, if you can, get fresh fruits and vegetables and protein and carbohydrates in moderation, but we tend to have far too much of it. And so eating good, fresh food, I just got back from 2 months in France, and I'm always amazed at how, the French, make a religion of eating, and they do it wonderfully well. You see very few obese people in France. And the reason is that down the street, there's a street market 3 days a week with this wonderful, fresh, and incredibly flavorful food. I had tomatoes and Brussels sprouts that were like a different creature from the stuff that they serve us here. And we're lucky in California. We have pretty good produce here. But it's nothing like it. So I think eating unprocessed and not carbohydrate-rich foods is a good way to manage your weight and diet and potentially to help normalize the insulin-cortisol balance as well.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions about going back to the number of hours of sleep recommended, and both Susan and let's see who else had a question. Susan and Margaret are curious if there are a number of too many hours of sleep at night that is not good, and so if a breast cancer patient is getting an inordinate amount of sleep, should they try to cut back?
That's a good question, and that can be a problem. I'd say if it's getting over 9, you may have a problem, and that's not good for you either. Too much sleep can be problematic. You're just not getting physical activity. It's possible for some of these people that the issue Beta raised before, that you may be sleeping very badly, and so feeling fatigued, staying in bed too long because you're trying to catch up with sleep. And like people with sleep apnea, literally wake up hundreds of times during the night because they start to fall deeply asleep, they have trouble breathing, and they wake up, and it keeps happening. So certainly if you're oversleeping, that's another reason to get a sleep examination and make sure that you don't have a problem like sleep apnea. But I'd say if it's under 7, it's not enough, and if it's over 9, it's probably too much, and both deserve some attention.
And to follow up, you kind of mentioned catching up on sleep. So Valerie wants to know if there is such a thing as catching up with sleeping, or does that actually hinder your sleep patterns?
No, that's a good point, Valerie. There is something called a sleep debt. And that is if you've been sleep deprived for several days, your body feels that you feel it, and you can make up for it by getting more sleep. Most of us do that on the weekend, so we tend to undersleep during the week, and then thank God you don't have to set that alarm Saturday and Sunday morning, and you catch up. It's better if you don't have to do that all the time, but if you are sleep deprived, it does make a difference. So getting extra sleep when you've been sleep deprived is a good thing. Your body does sort of start to restore its sleep-wakefulness activity rhythms, and that's a good thing to do. Great.
And Sherry has a question about meditation. How does meditation affect your sleep or your cortisol levels?
There are some studies that are beginning to suggest that meditation can help potentially restore circadian hormone rhythms. It seems to be, it's related to that vagal tone thing I talked about earlier, where if you're able to self-soothe during the day, you're not sort of constantly aroused. Your heart rate, blood pressure aren't going up. Your cortisol levels may not be going up as much when they shouldn't be. And so the capacity to self-soothe with meditation, self-hypnosis, I think physical activity for some is a soothing activity as well, can potentially help normalize these reactions. So handling stress well can, I think, potentially help to normalize these disrupted patterns of sleep and wakefulness. And if we've all had problems that keep us awake at night, and if you're handling those problems better during the day, you're more likely to sleep better at night, and that's good for your circadian cortisol rhythms.
Great. All right, we have time for a couple more questions. I have a question from Felicia, and she wants to know if you could say something about cortisol levels and drugs such as Herceptin.
I don't know of any evidence, Felicia, that Herceptin has any particular effect on cortisol levels. And I certainly would not worry about if you have a HER2 positive tumor and you're taking Herceptin, take it. It's a very effective treatment. And there's no reason that I know of to worry that it would interfere with your cortisol patterns.
All right. Dr. Karen Anderson has a comment and a question. She says that you seem to be making the assumption that the association you found is causal. However, it may be that there is an underlying cause. Perhaps changing sleep patterns is not the issue at all. And have you considered that?
Sure. But so for some of these studies, it is entirely possible, and that's one of the things we're looking at, is whether there's some intervening connection. You're absolutely right about that. The only thing that allows us to make any causal inferences is that we're making predictions. So if you have two correlations at the same time, one could be causing the other. You don't know which is which. But we do have data that suggests that dysregulation at one time predicts outcome at a much later time. So from a statistical point of view, you can make a causal inference. There may well, and we're looking actively at be other intervening variables that really account for it. That's absolutely right. But until we find them, we can at least assume that a dysregulation at one time is a predictor of outcome at another time.
Excellent. All right. And then we'll go ahead and do one more question, and it is a question about to what extent does lack of sleep affect blood pressure and in turn the impact on breast cancer? And that question is from Natasha.
Natasha, lack of sleep can, because you're having all of this physical arousal, because you have less vagal tone during the day, it can have an effect on blood pressure, and it can be associated with increased blood pressure. And actually, one interesting finding that's related to that is there have been a couple of big studies. There were women with breast cancer who have been treated for their hypertension with beta blockers, drugs like propranolol, that block sympathetic arousal and control blood pressure. But it also turns out that it looks as though their prognosis with the breast cancer is actually better. So blocking this chronic sympathetic arousal may actually have an effect on disease progression. Now, these were not randomized trials, so we can't be sure that it was the propranolol and not some other intervening factor. But there were pretty large-scale studies, and so it does suggest that blocking sympathetic arousal can have an effect on disease progression as well. So certainly hypertension and its treatment may be factors in disease progression as well.
Great, thank you. And our last question we have time for, and for those of you we haven't gotten to, we've got a couple people with still some questions, and we'll get back to you separately. But the final question is going back to sleep, and Betsy wants to know, how does waking to urinate a couple times a night impact cortisol or sleep effectiveness?
Well, it can interfere with sleep effectiveness, and some of us as we get older that becomes an issue, and you just have to do it. It's better to do it in a way that least disrupts your sleep. It's better if you can not turn on bright lights, for example. That will interfere with your sleep more. You don't want to fall down or trip on something, but if there's a way to minimize light exposure, that's good. All things being equal, you'd rather not have to get up to pee at night. It does interrupt sleep, but hopefully you get right back to sleep. So, and one bit of advice is, if you can see your clock from your bed, that's a bad thing. Turn it away, because seeing what time it is in itself an arousal cue, and it tends to wake you up. So whatever time it is what it is. So you want to do whatever you have to do, go to the bathroom, but minimize anything else that will tend to arouse you at night, and hopefully get better night's sleep.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Spiegel and Vita, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you everyone who attended the webinar. We really appreciate your support, and I think there was a lot of great discussion, a lot of great take-home messages today, and so thank you so much for that, and we will be posting the recording of the webinar on our website by the end of the week, and the website is armyofwomen.org. And if anyone has any follow-up questions or comments about the webinar, please email us. But thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.